Chapter 16 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 16 Karangarua District. Pleasures of habitation. My new companion. A climb on Scott's Hill. General features of the country. Ancient glaciers. Rotit Koiti. Alpine vegetation. Insect life at high altitudes. The pleasure of such homely food as potatoes, cabbages, and other vegetables, with mutton and bread, cannot be realized until one has been without them for months. Since October the previous year, I had not had any vegetable except ferns and a few onions, and our bread had been either ordinary damper, flour and water, or soda bread. The cream and milk, too, seemed far better than any I had ever tasted. Again, a man must spend a long period away from habitation before he can thoroughly appreciate a chair and table, for we had with us absolutely no luxury, nor had we an army of porters to carry tents, bedsteads, mattresses, etc., but had to content ourselves with some scrub branches or ferns to lie on, and a log in front of the bedding, about 4 or 5 inches in height, to sit upon while in our shelter. It may therefore be easily understood that a chair and table for our meals were very welcome, after months with the plate, when we had one, balanced on our knees while sitting on a log. It must not be supposed that I am bemoaning the discomfort of the work, because, though it might be rough and uncomfortable to the average man, I did not find it either the one or the other. But the comfort of even a rough farmhouse in South Westland is welcome for a change. It is also worthwhile to have hair and beard several inches long, in order to have the pleasure of a good crop, even with a pair of sheep shears. When we arrived at Scott's in February, I could tuck my hair under the collar of my shirt, and my beard was long and tangled. I found Douglas very little better, and only able to walk a few yards. He had been confined to his bed for some weeks after he had returned. It was perfectly useless for him to attempt further work, so we got a young fellow, Dick Fidian, recently out from England and digging at Hunt's Beach, to accompany me. I regretted afterwards that he had not been sent up to me when first Douglas came back in October, for he was a capital mate and plucky, which is more than can be said of the man who left me at Castle's Flat. He was also a good walker, and had the makings of a climber, so would have been, on the whole, preferable to poor old Bill. The Maori evidently had an exaggerated opinion of my powers, because not only did he give the road party on the Haast Pass track an extraordinary account of my climbing, but he went to see Dick and warned him that the work was "peli laf" rough, and also saying, "You fell no follow Harper into hills too teepy, tate up." "Oh yes," said Dick, "I can manage if he helps me with the rope." "Well, you fell. See me light, you no follow. See the monkey climb the pole?" asked Bill, working his hands and feet to indicate one of those toys that run up and down a stick. "Yes, often," said Dick. "Well, Harper he just the same as the monkey." However, Dick decided to come in spite of the Maori's wonderful yarns, and I could not have had a better companion than he proved to be. Instructions came from Hokitika to say that they had decided to try a saddle at the head of the Copeland River for a track to the Hermitage, in spite of the fact that it carried perpetual ice. I was to send in my map, etc., of the Karangarua country first, and then go over to the Hermitage via the Copeland River and report. This is the line I and others had wanted the authorities to examine for some 2 or 3 years past, so these instructions were very welcome. Accordingly, Dick and I went up to Bark Camp, and brought the stores and other things which were there to the futtah, and then sent up horses from Scott's to bring everything down to the flats, and, crossing the river, moved them up to a mile below the inflow of the Copeland, or further if possible. Here Dick was to camp and blaze a track up the spur to the grass line on Ryan's Peak, which we had to ascend later for some observations, while I plotted and sent in the map. Mr. Scott has a few sheep on the hill on the south of the river, where it flows out of the ranges, and finds the snow grass above the bush line very good pasturage in the summer. He had, however, left the animals there too long the previous season, and was unable to muster, owing to the winter snow having driven the sheep down into the thick scrub. Hearing that he was going up again, I decided to accompany him, and go back along the ridge to get a good view over Castle's Flat and other parts of the river for a few more observations and photographs. Leaving Dick therefore to continue the track up Ryan's Spur, I went with Scott up the Sheep Hill, and pushing back, we camped at the head of the Manukau Creek, which flows out near Jacob's River. One of the party was a young Maori, Dan Koiti, who was an excellent man on the hills, and he told me that, a month previously, he had followed some sheep back further than anyone had been, and found a large lake. Doubting his story somewhat, I went with him next day to a place where we could see not only the lake, which did exist after all, but also an extensive panorama of the ranges. While Dan went down to the water and back to our bivouac by another route, I spent my time in completing the observations, etc. From this point, R, a view of all three branches could be obtained, and an accurate idea formed of the size and direction of the vast ancient glaciers which evidently filled these valleys. The country appeared more weird than it did when we were up the river. The gigantic rock precipices and smooth slopes showed to advantage, and the very narrow ridges in evidence everywhere proved how hard and solid the rock was. The peculiar conformation of this district was also plainly visible, but it was no easier to account for than when up the valley. Every divergent range, and every spur on such ranges in this district, have a sloping side and a precipitous side. Thus, in all the branches of the Karangarua this is most evident. For instance, on the range between the Twain and the main branch, I was able on the Karangarua side to walk up a bare slope of smooth rock, only interrupted in places by a bluff or low cliff, running across or down it. But the vast precipices on the Twain side not only appear to be impossible to scale, but are equally hard to describe. Again in the Twain we have the slope of the Douglas Neve to the summit of the range on the southern side, but in the Copeland Valley the same range drops in enormous cliffs onto Welcome Flats. Between the Copeland River and Cook's we find on the southern side of the Copeland Range comparatively long spurs, but on the northern there are inaccessible cliffs of Copeland Peak, which I attempted to describe in a former chapter. Take one example of the spurs of these divergent ranges, namely, the ridge between Regina Creek and Twain Gorge. Here we find a slope varying from 32 degrees to 36 degrees, and in a few places a trifle more on the Twain side, but Regina Creek is walled in on that bank by steep precipices. The slope on the Karangarua Range is the same as the dip of the rock, and it is probable that the great precipices are due to the fracture of the formation. Unfortunately, however, I am not sufficiently well grounded in geology to attempt a solution or explanation of this peculiarity. Therefore, having described it to the best of my ability, I shall leave it for others to explain. For studying the action of ancient glaciers on mountains and valleys, this river and its branches give as good opportunities as any district I know. From the inflow of the Copeland River to Castle's Flat, the valley is roughly speaking a mile wide, filled with glacial deposit, which descends in gentle slopes from the lower part of the hills to the centre of the valley. Through this moraine drift the river has cut a channel, leaving terraces on each side from 20 feet to nearly 100 feet high, while its course is full of large erratic blocks, in some places completely blocking the valley. The top of the terrace is chiefly flat for some chains back, cut through here and there by deep channels, and generally covered with large boulders. At the end of the spur, opposite the inflow of the Copeland River, the glacial drift is piled up for some 400 feet, while the spur itself, above and behind the drift, shows in places ice-smoothed rock. The slopes of Mount Migloin and other mountains into Castle's Flat have been described in a former chapter. Above the flat the valley narrows to half its original width, and the whole floor rises abruptly for 1,200 feet, the ancient ice having evidently come down in an ice fall at this point. The faces of the abrupt step in the valley are rounded and smooth, forming what might be called whalebacks. From this point to the saddle the valley has been cut out of hard gneiss rock, and has high bare cliffs on the south, and smooth rocky slopes on the left, while the floor is of the same rock, and slopes gently down on the south from the foot of the precipices to the river, broken here and there by terraces. In the upper portion of the valley from Lame Duck Flat to the saddle, the rock floor has been covered with morainic drift, as the ancient glacier retreated up the valley, and debris from the hillsides. In places, the whole surface of soil and boulders has slipped away, leaving naked rock slopes. At Lame Duck Flat, the river runs on a smooth rocky bottom, and from here to the bar below Castle's Flat, it has evidently met with less obstruction, and, flowing over rock unprotected by debris, has gradually cut the floor down to its present level. After leaving this flat, the river descends gradually through the Dovetail Gorge to the Great Cataracts, leaving behind it on the left a rock terrace, which gradually grows in height as the river descends until at the cataract it is upward of 300 feet high. From the top of this terrace there is a gentle slope for a few hundred yards back, of smooth rock, interrupted by 2 or 3 terraces, to the foot of the great solid precipices, which rise from 1 to 2,000 feet above. This was evidently the old valley bottom, abraded by the ice. In places where a creek comes down to join the river, broad roads of bare rock have been cleared by the water through the trees, interrupted by a few waterfalls, and on reaching the terrace drop over into the river, making picturesque cascades. Picturesque, because the rock is worn into fantastic grooves and channels. The actual cataracts are, I imagine, due to the large erratic blocks left behind by the ice in its retreat, forming a bar across the valley, and the hills being too steep to hold them, they have fallen and accumulated at the bottom. These have gradually collected in the gorge as the water has cut away the ground underneath, and, having collected, are now preventing the water from further deepening the gorge. The stones in the cataracts of the 3 branches, meeting in castles, are of immense size. It is possible that large blocks of rock have broken away and come down from the hill on the right bank, and also slips may have helped to form the Karangarua cataract, but the other 2, Twain River and Regina Creek, are solely due to large boulders left by the old glacier. There is a curious freak of nature, which I have not mentioned before, on the main branch. In the gorge by the great cataract, the bush, as in all other valleys, is composed of large rata, kamahi, totra, and miro trees. But suddenly on the south bank this class of timber ceases, and the mountain birch begins. The line of demarcation is very marked, and neither class of tree encroaches on the other. On the north bank the usual rata forest continues, with only 2 or perhaps 3 birch trees on that side, but on the south bank the latter have absolute possession till the Theodore Falls and Creek are reached just above Lame Duck Flat. Here they cease, as suddenly as they began, and the usual mountain vegetation continues on both sides to the head of the river. On Christmas Flat, however, a clump of about a dozen large birch trees can be seen towering above the low mountain scrub. It is a curious freak of nature, and I can see no reason for it. The real birch forest country does not commence for some distance south of this river, and this isolated patch of birch forest is the only I know of in this district. Judging from the general appearance and formation of this part of the country, I believe that in the remote past an immense ice field existed south of Mount Sefton, and discharged itself in 3 main streams seawards. The low saddle of the Douglas Pass would form no obstacle to the junction of the ice fields off Sefton and those further south. Even assuming that the limit of the ice-smoothed surfaces coincides with the level of the ancient glaciers, and that they were no higher than these marks are now found, the streams of ice flowing from this central field must have been of great depth, for they have left marks with great distinctiveness in the Twain and Karangarua valleys. The spur from Mount Glorious, which divides the Twain and Regina Creek valleys, has a high rocky hill of conical shape rising at its extremity, some 3,700 feet above Castle's Flat. Behind this is a low, flat-topped depression, and it seems evident that the most northern stream of ice flowed down the Twain Valley and covered the lower end of this spur, being joined by a small glacier from the north down Regina Valley. The central stream came over the Karangarua Pass and down the main valley, joining the northern stream in Castle's Flat. It then flowed against the hill on which we are now supposed to be, close to Mount Macdonald, and has, I think, left its mark in the number of large blocks which lie on the side in places. Then, turning in a northerly direction, it would join forces with a great glacier which filled the valley of the Copeland River and came over Baker's Saddle from the central neve, or the Mount Cook of that day. The combined ice flow would by this time have assumed enormous proportions, far exceeding the ancient Waiho Glacier, and larger than the old Cook River Glacier, and, flowing out onto the flats, would no doubt augment the great ice field at the base of the hills. These glaciers must all have been of considerable thickness, and it is perhaps possible that the Twain and Karangarua ice streams overflowed the ridge below Point R on the map, to a slight extent before turning towards the lower country. There is a depression in that ridge, in a direct line with a depression behind the conical hill. A line drawn from the present Douglas Glacier down the Manukai'au River would pass through both depressions. That ice has been at work in the head of the latter river in the past there is ample evidence, but the most interesting and weird roches moutonnées at the source of that river may only be due to smaller local glacier having no distinct connection with the larger one. I am inclined to think that the above-mentioned depression here is accidental, and has no connection with the one behind the conical hill, being rather too high above sea level. Further evidence, however, is forthcoming of the great depth of ice on Ryan's Peak, which Dick and I ascended later in the season. There were two distinct lines of boulders lying on the Copeland side of the peak at a height of over 4,000 feet above the sea, which had every appearance of a lateral moraine. The ice lines in the upper valleys of the Karangarua and Twain, which are to be seen as high as 5,800 feet above sea level and fully 3,000 feet above the present floor of the valley, all point to the same fact. On the period of retreat beginning, the glaciers would shrink and leave behind them the great mass of moraine accumulations in the valley below Castle's Flat and by the inflow of the Copeland River. Also, in the latter river there are large erratic blocks scattered on the hillsides by the retreating ice. Having gradually retired up the valley and separated from the Copeland Glacier, the Twain ice would probably find its way over the low depression into Regina Creek and, at the same time, send another stream down the gorge. Douglas, however, from what he saw at Bark Camp, is not inclined to believe that ice ever came through this gorge, but thinks it is due to a fissure in the rock formation. This I cannot agree with, for the western side has been most certainly abraded by ice, and there is a large loose boulder lying on a ledge some way up the precipice on the eastern side of the gorge. My opinion is that the Twain Glacier found its way to Castle's Flat through this opening long after the Karangarua had retreated above the cataracts, and is responsible for the bar of moraine which I found on the flat. I have mentioned already Crusoe's Island and Queen's Knoll, which are evidently remains of a moraine, for on following the line back towards Mount McGloin, I found other small heaps of boulders. There is in my mind no doubt that an ice stream came over the Karangarua Pass, for the rock is ice-worn, and large blocks scattered on its slopes. There are also 3 distinct ice lines in the valley, especially noticeable between the pass and Troit River. I believe that this glacier would not be cut off from the central ice field until it had retired up the valley to Castle's Flat. But as the period of shrinkage progressed, there is no doubt that it would suddenly be separated from the main source of supply of the Karangarua Pass, which is upwards of 5,600 feet above sea level, and having no high peaks near it from which to draw fresh supplies, it would suddenly and rapidly retreat up the valley from Castle's Flat to the head, for I presume the fact of so little morainic deposit in the upper portion of this valley is due to a sudden retreat such as this. The idea of a stream of ice flowing over Baker's Saddle, 6,300 feet, is supported by the presence of sandstone blocks in the Copeland Valley from the same formation as Mount Cook. But as the main range near the footstool has some of the same rock, it is possible that these stones came from the divide between Stokes and that peak. Yet, as it has not been closely examined along there, it is hard to say. However, such a low depression as Baker's Saddle must, I think, have been an outlet for the ice of the central neve lying near the Mount Cook of that day. The third stream of ice from the supposed ice field went down the Landsborough, helped by glaciers from the Hooker and present dividing range, but whether it discharged its water westward or eastwards, I will not presume to offer an opinion. There seem, however, good reasons for supposing that the former range at one time formed the watershed between the two coasts. The lake of which Dan Coiti informed me is a most interesting and picturesque little alpine tarn. It lies under Mount Macdonald on the seaward side of the ridge, and is half a mile long by 200 yards across, draining into Jacob's River. I named it Roto Lake to Coiti, after the finder. There is no bar of morainic accumulations at the lower end, but it is one of those rock basins which is difficult to explain, except on the theory that it was excavated by a glacier. The rocks, smooth and ice-worn, descend precipitously into the water, which is apparently of great depth. Unfortunately, avalanche debris and a stream from Macdonald are gradually filling it up. The vegetation, flowers, grass and scrub in this district is the same as elsewhere in our Alps. The mountain scrub on the eastern side of the dividing range is, where it grows, as dense as that of the west coast, but is found in such small quantities that it gives little trouble. The shrubs of which it is composed are all found on the west coast, and, So far as I could discover, there are only 3 mountain plants which do not grow on both sides of the range. The thorny wild Irishman, Dioscorea tomato, I have never seen on the west coast Alps, while in the Tasman Valley it grows with great luxuriance. The nai, said to be a heath, and incense plant, a myrtle, of which I have found only 2 specimens, are both peculiar to the Westland Alps. The latter has a larger leaf, and the shrub is much smaller in size than the mountain musk, which flourishes on both sides of the Alps. The former I have already described in Chapter 5. While talking of plants, there is a very awkward swordgrass, Asaphila colensoi, which we call the Spaniard. It has bayonet-shaped leaves 2 feet or more long, which will sometimes pierce the leather of a boot, and at all times when one is going through the long snowgrass, it will make its presence known in a most unpleasant and unmistakable manner. Without having made a complete collection of the numerous alpine flowers, it is of course impossible to say whether there are any peculiar to either side of the divide, but I am inclined to think that there is no difference in this respect. There are many flowering plants found on the Alps in Westland, which are not found, or at least are not common, in the Tasman district, but they flourish in other localities on the eastern side. The great majority of New Zealand alpine flowers are white. In fact, there are comparatively few coloured ones. The most beautiful is the now well-known mountain lily, Ranunculus lyalii, which is the finest alpine flower I have seen in any country. Besides this, there are 3 or 4 kinds of ranunculus, some of which are bright yellow, and more plentiful on the western ranges than the eastern. 3 or 4 kinds of daisies, or salmisias, are met with in great luxuriance, above 3,500 feet in Westland. The finest of these has a white flower, with a yellow centre, and grows to 3 inches in diameter. Their broad silvery green leaves are over a foot in length, and are pure white underneath. This white underleaf can be stripped off, and resembles thin white kid, and if it is twisted and knotted into a short string, it is almost unbreakable. I have found the stripping of one leaf strong enough, when rolled between my fingers, to stand the strain of as hard a pull as either Dick or I could give. The grass which grows on the Alps is coarse and long, but makes good pasturage after it has been once burnt, though care has to be taken that it is not burnt in the wrong season, or it will never grow again. It only seeds once in 3 years, so far as I have observed. We call this snowgrass the climber's friend, because it is absolutely safe to catch hold of when going over the Alp, and no ordinary weight or pull will uproot it. Edelweiss, of a different kind to that growing in Switzerland, but very pretty, is to be found in great profusion from 3,000 to 6,000 feet above sea level, and several varieties of gentians are to be met with on the lower Alps. Douglas talks of an anemone which he once saw, but we have never found any in flower while together. It is a brilliant yellow, and he says, as beautiful a plant as he has ever seen. However, not having myself found a specimen, it is difficult to say what it is, or whether it is peculiar to one locality only. I do not consider the subalpine flora of New Zealand equal, as a whole, to that of Switzerland, for though the ranunculaceae and salmisias are perhaps finer than anything on the Alps of Europe, the smaller plants are not so varied, plentiful, or brilliant. We never see an Alp here showing such a blaze of colour as those in some parts of the European mountains. Taking the central portion of the Southern Alps as a whole, I should say that vegetation ceases at 6,200 feet above sea level. Isolated instances are found of its reaching 6,600 feet, or even more. I have found a small patch of Edelweiss at 6,800 feet, and Douglas reports that he once found a, quote, single pale yellow anemone growing on a bare patch surrounded by snow at an altitude of nearly 8,000 feet, end quote. This, I think, must be considered too exceptional to take into account, and is probably only a seedling growing for that one season. However, it was not in the district now under consideration. Birds and insects are fairly plentiful in the high Alps, and I believe in every case are common to both sides of the range. The highest life that I have found, except the blowfly, Calliphora, which follows one everywhere, is a black weta, Hemidina, and a black butterfly, Peronodamon pluto. The former has a body nearly an inch long, and delicate antennae 1.5 inches in length. I have found them walking or hopping over a snowfield some 8,500 feet above sea level on Mount de la Beche, and Mannering reports that he has found them still higher on rocks where even lichens have ceased to exist. The black butterfly has a slow lazy flight at a high altitude, but when found on the lower glaciers it is as lively as most of its kind. Grasshoppers are plentiful on the grass, and also green lizards, nultinus, which grow to a considerable size. The commonest of all insects is the moraine spider. They are large black fellows, and are seen in hundreds on lateral moraines, and I have rarely found a patch of surface moraine, however isolated, without one spider living like Robinson Crusoe on his desert island. How a spider could have found its way to a patch of moraine, surrounded by a mile at least of broken and crevassed ice, is difficult to say, and what he lives on when he has reached it is a still more difficult question. On the Franz Josef, broken and crevassed as it is, we found numbers of these insects on the middle of the glacier far away from moraine. Douglas acknowledges the same difficulty in attempting to explain their presence in the midst of all these crevasses, but puts forward a few suggestions. Perhaps, he says, they have lost themselves. Perhaps they are practicing for a polar expedition, a sort of arachnida nasinae. But the puzzle is, how do they cross these crevasses? Why do they not get their feet frozen? I dare say, while the sun is shining, they are comfortable enough, quietly freezing towards evening and thawing out again next day to proceed on their journey. We saw no dead ones. When chased, they go tumbling down a deep crevasse, as if it was a haven of refuge for oppressed spiders. Whether they ever come back, I cannot say. While on this glacier, we found some small insects in the pools on the ice, near the icefall, which were black and about 1/8 of an inch long. They took refuge in the minute cells in the ice. No doubt they were the larvae of some insect, but the pools would freeze solid every night, so I do not quite understand why their parents chose such cold quarters for them. Besides the kea, the only bird found in localities surrounded by ice and snow is the little mountain wren, Seneca sylvestris, a peculiar inquisitive little fellow with no tail and thin, comparatively long legs, on which he hops from stone to stone or hummock to hummock on the ice, coming quite close to one, bowing and bobbing like a little machine. I have never seen him quiet for a moment. This bird always reminds me of a feathered walnut on 2 thin white sticks, about 2 inches long, which have a spring in them worked by clockwork. They are found everywhere in the high Alps and on the west coast, but for some hours before rain they collect in flocks and descend to the bush line, where they flutter about in company with the canaries, keeping up a bewildering chirping. When on Castle's Flat, I saw a pretty little owl from 3 to 4 inches in height. It had strayed from its hole in the daylight, and was so dazzled that it made no attempt to escape. Rather foolishly, I did not shoot it, for it seemed a pity to kill so harmless and pretty a bird. Since returning to Christchurch, I have ascertained that though reports of such an owl have been made before, no specimen has ever been obtained. This, however, is not a dweller in high country. Owing to the very small allowance made by government for the work of exploration, we were unable to carry proper appliances and materials for collecting flowers and insects. Had we been allowed a larger party, there is no doubt that a most exhaustive collection could have been made during our wanderings over the Alps, and a most satisfactory description given of vegetable and insect life. I have only here attempted to put forward a general idea of the most interesting features in this direction. End of chapter 16.